The gravy bowl slipped from Emily's hands as Thomas's shove sent her staggering, and the room froze around them in brittle silence. She felt heat rush up her spine, a mix of fear and humiliation, while every face at the table pretended nothing had happened at all. Her mother kept cutting turkey, as if the crash on the floor were only a stray thought she refused to acknowledge or understand. Emily steadied herself, realizing the familiar ache in her chest was no longer something she could force into quiet obedience. Before she could escape the suffocating room, her grandmother touched her arm and pressed a thick envelope into her trembling fingers. In that small gesture, Emily sensed a truth waiting to surface, heavier and more dangerous than anything she had dared to name. Emily was 8 when Thomas moved into the house, bringing rules that felt heavier than his suitcases. He rearranged the furniture first, then the rhythms of their lives, then the way Emily was allowed to breathe. He spoke softly, but carried an authority that demanded obedience without ever raising his voice. Every morning began with inspections of chores, shoes, posture, and even the tone in Emily's greetings. If she hesitated, he marked it as disrespect, and she learned quickly that silence was safer than truth. Her mother repeated his rules, as if they were commandments carved into the walls of their kitchen. Emily tried to follow them all, but the rules changed depending on Thomas's mood each passing day. He didn't hit her, not in ways anyone could see, but his punishments left bruises no one ever questioned. He isolated her with subtle comments about how sensitive she was and how easily she disappointed people. She began to believe her feelings were flaws, and her thoughts were evidence of her selfishness. When she cried, he told her she was dramatic, and when she smiled, he asked why she was pretending. Her mother told her Thomas only wanted discipline and structure because love required order and effort. Emily wondered why love felt like walking barefoot across broken glass that no one else claimed to see. Thomas monitored her schoolwork and insisted her teachers were too lenient and misled by her quietness. He demanded she rewrite assignments for minor errors until she couldn't remember what she wanted to say. He watched her eat at dinner, as if measuring how much space she deserved to take in the world. If she asked for seconds, he raised an eyebrow, and the request died before her lips could form it. If she ate too little, he lectured her on wastefulness and her lack of gratitude. Emily learned to study his expressions more carefully than any textbook she used at school. His approvals were rare, brief, and always followed by new expectations she could never meet. He told her to speak up, then scolded her for arguing when she finally found a voice. He told her to show confidence, then mocked her when she tried to express an opinion. Her mother watched with a strange affection for Thomas's methods, calling them necessary corrections. Emily started apologizing before she understood what she was accused of, a reflex he rewarded with praise. The house felt colder each year, though the thermostat never moved from its polished metal setting. Emily's bedroom became a sanctuary of whispers, where she kept journals she tore up before bed. She feared Thomas would read them and twist her words into new charges of disobedience. Birthdays became performances where she smiled on cue and thanked him for gifts chosen to impress others. He never asked what she liked. He only asked whether she was being grateful enough. Family gatherings exposed the cracks in her composure, but no one seemed to notice the tremor in her voice. Thomas charmed relatives with stories about teaching Emily responsibility, painting her as difficult but improving. Her mother nodded proudly, unaware of how Emily's stomach tightened at every approving glance he received. Emily learned to shrink herself to avoid provoking his disappointment, which always felt like a sentence. She avoided friendships because Thomas believed children absorbed bad habits from weaker households. When teachers suggested she join clubs, her mother declined for her, claiming Emily needed structure at home. Over time, Emily forgot what it felt like to want something that wasn't permitted or corrected. She carried the weight of invisible expectations that bent her spine long before she reached adulthood. And each night, She whispered apologies into the dark, hoping the house would forgive her for existing. College felt like stepping into a world where the air finally moved freely around Emily. She walked across campus with a strange lightness, unsure if she was allowed to enjoy it. No one monitored her footsteps or corrected the angle of her shoulders as she passed strangers. Her roommate, Jenna, laughed loudly and asked direct questions that startled Emily at first. Emily answered softly, waiting for judgment that never came, and the absence of criticism felt unreal. For the first time, she noticed how other students spoke without fear of being misinterpreted. They disagreed, teased, apologized, and recovered without the world collapsing beneath their feet. Emily watched them and wondered how they learned to exist without bracing for punishment. Her professors encouraged her ideas, even the imperfect ones, and she struggled to trust their sincerity. Compliments felt like traps, and she waited for them to turn into lectures as they always had at home. When nothing bad followed, she started writing more boldly, though her hands trembled each time. Therapy began after her advisor gently suggested she seek support for her constant self-doubt. Emily sat in the therapist's office, carefully choosing words to avoid sounding dramatic or ungrateful. The therapist asked about her childhood, and Emily recited facts as if they belonged to someone else. She said Thomas was strict but well-intentioned, and her mother simply valued order and discipline. The therapist listened quietly and asked why those explanations sounded rehearsed. Emily felt her throat tighten and answered with the same practiced lines she had always used. When the therapist mentioned emotional abuse, Emily immediately rejected the idea with quiet panic. She insisted her family was normal, even if she never felt safe enough to breathe around them. The therapist didn't argue. She simply asked Emily to notice the tension in her body as she spoke. Emily realized her hands were clenched, nails leaving crescents on her palms without her noticing. Despite her denial, she returned each week because something inside her needed space to unravel. She talked about the rules she grew up with, describing them as traditions rather than restrictions. She explained how Thomas corrected her tone and posture, calling it guidance she should appreciate. Her therapist asked how often appreciation felt like fear, and Emily had no answer. Even so, she refused to label anything as abuse, because numbing it felt like betraying her family. During school breaks, she returned home and slipped instantly into the old patterns she hated. Her voice softened, her shoulders dropped, and she avoided eye contact the moment Thomas entered. He noticed her new confidence and smirked as if reminding her who she used to be. The air in the house carried a familiar heaviness that folded her back into obedience. Her mother commented that college made her too sensitive, and Emily apologized without thinking. At night, she lay awake, feeling her progress at school shrink under the weight of old fears. When she went back to campus, she felt ashamed of how quickly she unraveled at home. Jenna noticed her exhaustion and invited her to join study groups and weekend outings. Emily hesitated, but accepted, learning slowly that connection didn't always lead to punishment. She laughed more, though the sound still startled her, as if joy were something borrowed. In quieter moments, she realized her world had grown, and she wasn't ready to shrink again. Yet each holiday approached like a shadow stretching across her progress, dragging her backward. She feared returning to the house, where her voice never felt like her own. And each time she crossed that threshold, she wondered if freedom was only temporary for someone like her. The Thanksgiving table gleamed with food, but Emily felt only a hollow tension pressing against her ribs. Thomas sat at the head, smiling faintly, eyes sharp as he watched her reach for the gravy. He shoved the bowl too hard, and it tipped, spilling thick sauce across the polished wood in her lap. Emily stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table, heat and humiliation rushing through her. The room froze. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by a fork clattering. Her mother looked away, pretending nothing had happened, lips pressed in a tight line. Her siblings continued eating, faces downcast, unwilling to acknowledge the moment that pierced the air. Only her grandmother, Margaret, rose slowly from her chair, her eyes fixed on Emily with quiet resolve. Margaret handed Emily a thick envelope, its weight startling in her small hands. The paper crackled as Emily opened it, revealing stacks of carefully gathered documents. There were police reports Thomas had manipulated and then withdrawn from official records. Bank statements showed the trust fund Emily had never fully controlled had been siphoned for years. Handwritten notes detailed instances of Thomas's manipulations, calculated to leave no visible scars. Her mother's complicity was chronicled in careful, factual language Margaret had preserved for decades. Emily's hands shook as she sifted through the evidence, every piece confirming suspicions she had denied. Margaret's letter fell to the table, the words simple but heavy. "I stayed silent too long. It ends now." Emily reread the lines, disbelief and relief mixing like storm clouds breaking over her chest. Thomas shifted in his chair, noticing her distraction, his gaze sharp and accusatory. Her mother leaned forward slightly, a frown tugging at her lips, but said nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Emily to crumble under decades of fear. But she didn't. She felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, clarity and righteous anger. She realized the years of small humiliations, corrections, and silences were documented, undeniable. For the first time, she understood she wasn't imagining the patterns that had haunted her childhood. Margaret touched her arm gently, her eyes urging Emily to see the truth and take it seriously. Emily felt a strange power, the knowledge that she had tangible proof of abuse and deceit. The envelope contained more than documents. It carried validation she had yearned for since she was a girl. She saw the contrast between the world at the table and the reality Margaret had preserved in ink and paper. For years, Emily had questioned her memory, doubted her feelings, and excused Thomas's cruelty. Now, confronted with facts and evidence, denial became impossible, and clarity replaced fear. She noticed small signs of Thomas's impatience, the tightening of his jaw, the way he studied her movements. Her mother shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, as if aware of the silent accusations surrounding her. Emily understood she could no longer ignore the truth, no matter how uncomfortable the confrontation might be. The envelope was not just a record. It was a lifeline, a tool to finally face the past. Margaret whispered, "This is your moment, Emily. Take it. Don't let it slip." Emily felt the weight of decades lift slightly, the spark of courage igniting in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt she could stand, not just physically, but emotionally and morally. She held the evidence close, knowing that what had been hidden for years would now guide her next steps. And in that frozen, tense kitchen, Emily realized the long silence was over, and her voice could finally emerge. Emily spent days poring over the documents her grandmother had collected, piecing together patterns. She discovered Thomas had a history of controlling and abusing other children long before she existed. Rebecca Wells, the daughter from his previous marriage, had blogged about her experiences in detail. Emily reached out to Rebecca, unsure if she would respond or dismiss her as another complaint. Rebecca replied quickly, offering empathy and resources Emily had never known existed. She shared therapy exercises, journal prompts, and legal advice that had helped her cope with Thomas. Together, they compared timelines and incidents, discovering strikingly similar methods of manipulation. Emily learned that Thomas had systematically siphoned funds from multiple trust accounts for decades. The evidence made her stomach twist, realizing this had affected far more lives than she imagined. Rebecca provided copies of emails, bank statements, and medical records she had kept from her own case. Emily began cataloging the information, creating a file that documented years of abuse with precision. She felt a strange sense of relief, knowing she was not alone in being targeted by Thomas. For the first time, the fear that she was overreacting started to dissipate, replaced by clarity. Rebecca introduced Emily to a lawyer who specialized in long-term emotional and financial abuse. The lawyer advised Emily on steps to protect her assets and begin a legal investigation into Thomas. Emily felt both nervous and empowered, finally holding guidance from someone with experience. She realized the importance of connecting with other victims to understand the full scope of Thomas's actions. Emails, records, and testimonies built a network of evidence that could not be ignored or destroyed. Emily and Rebecca met several times, comparing notes, reviewing financial statements, and drafting questions. The more she learned, the more she understood the meticulous planning Thomas had employed over years. Emily felt her childhood trauma shift from a private burden to documented, undeniable reality. The documents revealed how Thomas had manipulated their mothers to cover his actions repeatedly. Each story she uncovered painted a clearer picture of a pattern spanning decades, far beyond her own experience. Emily began identifying emotional triggers she had learned to ignore or suppress for years. She understood how he had isolated her and Rebecca, making them doubt their own memories. Emily wrote down everything she remembered, pairing her experiences with Rebecca's documented events. The lawyer advised keeping detailed notes of every interaction, email, and threat received. Emily started organizing her evidence chronologically, constructing a timeline of abuse. Rebecca shared strategies for coping with the emotional weight of confronting the past. Emily began therapy sessions again, now prepared to face both the psychological and legal challenges. She realized that this process was not just about justice, but reclaiming her own sense of reality. Every new piece of evidence added to her confidence, slowly transforming fear into resolve. Emily learned how to communicate with Thomas strategically, avoiding traps while gathering proof. She started noticing patterns in his manipulation attempts and anticipated his tactics. Through careful documentation, Emily and Rebecca began connecting dots, seeing a network of victims emerge. The work was exhausting, emotionally draining, yet deeply validating for Emily's sense of self. She realized confronting Thomas would require courage, strategy, and the support of those who understood. Every day, she felt more equipped to face him and the mother who had enabled his actions. Emily's world expanded beyond fear, showing her the possibility of accountability and justice. For the first time, she felt ready to step into confrontation, armed with truth and evidence she could trust. Emily returned home determined to take action, armed with evidence she had meticulously gathered. She met with the lawyer Rebecca had recommended to review the trust fund irregularities and documents. The lawyer advised her on legal strategies, explaining each step and potential outcomes in detail. Emily documented every conversation with her mother and Thomas, recording threats and manipulations. She began compiling emails, letters, and financial statements into a single, organized legal file. The lawyer discovered additional victims of Thomas through financial trails and prior complaints. Emily contacted them carefully, ensuring privacy while gathering corroborating statements and records. Each new account strengthened her case and helped her understand the full scope of his control. Emily faced emails from her mother, attempting guilt, blame, and subtle threats to silence her. She kept them, reading them only with the lawyer present to avoid emotional manipulation. Emily drafted a letter to the extended family, summarizing the verified abuses and providing proof. She hesitated, fearing backlash, but knew silence had allowed the pattern to continue for decades. The email went out, concise but firm, exposing both Thomas and her mother's complicity. Responses arrived slowly, some in shock, others defensive, and a few finally admitting prior knowledge. The lawyer filed petitions to secure control over the misused trust funds and prevent further theft. Emily received word of the first legal injunction, stopping Thomas from accessing her financial accounts. She coordinated with other victims to share their stories safely and ensure their voices were heard. Thomas reacted predictably, sending threatening messages and claiming misinterpretation of facts. Emily forwarded these to her lawyer, who documented each as harassment and evidence of intent. Her mother called repeatedly, pleading, then yelling, trying to sway Emily emotionally. Emily maintained boundaries, responding only in writing or through the lawyer to protect herself. She attended therapy sessions regularly, using them to process stress, fear, and anger strategically. The lawyer uncovered more accounts of abuse spanning decades, expanding the ongoing investigation. Emily realized Thomas's manipulations had affected dozens of people she had never known. Each revelation strengthened her resolve to see the legal process through, despite emotional strain. Family gatherings became tense, with some relatives distancing themselves and others quietly supportive. Emily remained composed, presenting facts without apology, letting evidence speak louder than emotions. She tracked every interaction meticulously, creating a timeline showing repeated abuse and cover-ups. Her legal team prepared subpoenas, witness lists, and financial audits to solidify the upcoming case. Emily felt a mixture of fear and empowerment as she confronted the reality of her mother's choices. She grieved the relationship she had hoped to salvage, realizing accountability was more important. Each day, Emily built confidence in her ability to stand up for herself and others harmed by Thomas. She began mentoring younger family members quietly, showing them how to recognize manipulation. Emily also started writing a journal to chronicle every step of her journey, both legal and emotional. The lawyer advised patience, emphasizing that justice often required persistence and meticulous proof. Emily accepted this, understanding the process would be long, but necessary to break the cycle. She felt a sense of solidarity with the victims she had connected with, forming a small network of support. Despite the tension and threats, Emily no longer felt isolated. She had allies and evidence on her side. With each legal filing, each documented threat, Emily inched closer to reclaiming her autonomy fully. She knew the process would be grueling, but she faced it with clarity, determination, and unwavering resolve. The family began to fracture, old alliances breaking as Emily's revelations circulated. Some relatives admitted they had known, but stayed silent out of fear or loyalty. Others refused to acknowledge anything, siding with Thomas and excusing years of manipulation. Thomas hired a high-profile lawyer, sending formal threats and warnings to intimidate Emily. She remained calm, knowing the documentation she had collected was airtight and comprehensive. Her mother escalated attempts at emotional control, sending guilt-laden messages and veiled threats. Emily saved every email and text, forwarding them to her lawyer as evidence of harassment. Despite the pressure, Emily felt a growing sense of clarity and empowerment she had never known. She focused on therapy, learning to distinguish fear from rational caution in every situation. Thomas tried to isolate her from supportive relatives, but Emily refused to respond to manipulation. She coordinated with other victims, sharing updates and advice for legal proceedings and safety. The lawyer uncovered multiple accounts of fraud and abuse, solidifying Emily's case against Thomas. Family gatherings became tense, some members silently judging, others quietly supportive of Emily. Her mother continued to defend Thomas, refusing to accept evidence and blaming Emily for conflict. Emily realized she could not change her mother's choices and accepted the emotional distance. She felt sorrow for the relationship lost, but also relief at no longer hiding the truth. Emily began preparing for court, reviewing every document, timeline, and witness statement carefully. Each legal step reinforced her sense of agency and control over a life once dominated by fear. The network of victims Emily had built provided testimony, moral support, and shared documentation. They validated her experiences, showing her that Thomas's abuse spanned decades and was systematic. Emily learned to anticipate Thomas's attempts at deception and manipulation during legal processes. She practiced staying calm, responding only through her lawyer or written statements when necessary. As injunctions and legal filings progressed, Emily felt a tangible sense of safety returning. She understood that control over her finances and evidence was a key step in reclaiming autonomy. Each confrontation with Thomas or her mother became less about fear and more about asserting boundaries. Emily started mentoring younger family members, teaching them to recognize manipulative behavior early. Her therapist helped her process anger, grief, and the complex emotions of betrayal and justice. She documented the ongoing abuse from Thomas and emotional manipulation from her mother carefully. Emily noticed that some relatives quietly apologized for past silence, acknowledging their fear. Others avoided her, unwilling to confront the truth or abandon Thomas, and Emily let them go. She learned to channel frustration into practical steps, organizing evidence, attending court, planning strategy. Her legal team discovered additional victims who provided affidavits and corroborating statements. Emily's confidence grew as the system began to recognize the depth and severity of Thomas's actions. She realized she could no longer rely on her mother for support or validation, and accepted it fully. Emily focused on healing herself, building routines that prioritized emotional and physical safety. She maintained contact with Rebecca and other victims, forming a support network that was both strategic and caring. Thomas continued attempts at intimidation, but each effort only strengthened Emily's resolve. She documented every threat, call, and message for court, ensuring no attempt went unnoticed. Emily began visualizing a future where she was fully independent and free from manipulation. Therapy, legal preparation, and support from allies gradually replaced fear with determination. She acknowledged grief for the relationship with her mother, but remained resolute in pursuing justice. Every day, Emily reclaimed a part of herself that had been suppressed for decades. She recognized that the path was long and difficult, but each small victory reinforced her liberation. Emily no longer reacted out of fear. She acted strategically, empowered by knowledge, support, and evidence. The cycle of abuse was breaking, and she could finally imagine a life defined by choice, safety, and clarity. Emily submitted the final legal documents, feeling the weight of decades lift from her shoulders. She no longer feared Thomas or the mother who had enabled his abuse for so many years. The court acknowledged the evidence, granting protective measures and control over her trust fund. Emails, records, and witness statements confirmed the patterns of manipulation and abuse. Emily felt a quiet victory, knowing her truth was validated and documented for the first time. She spoke openly with Rebecca and other survivors, sharing relief and strategies for healing. Therapy helped her process grief, anger, and the complex emotions of confronting family betrayal. Emily realized she could finally nurture the child she once feared and silenced within herself. She established boundaries, cutting off toxic communication while maintaining necessary legal contact. Her grandmother stood by her, providing emotional support and a sense of unwavering safety. Emily began volunteering to mentor young victims, guiding them to recognize and escape abuse early. The burden of silence was gone, replaced by agency, clarity, and empowerment she had never known. She wrote in her journal daily, chronicling growth, victories, and steps toward full emotional freedom. Emily understood the journey ahead would require continued courage, but she was prepared. The cycle of abuse had ended in her life, and she could finally imagine a future defined by choice. Every small act of self-care and justice reinforced her liberation and the reclaiming of her story. She no longer felt trapped by fear or guilt, embracing life with purpose, clarity, and resilience. Emily smiled, knowing she had finally spoken, fought, and secured the life she deserved.